Hood by J M Bulpett. Read by Jack Collard.
Chapter 11. Alvaro Garcia's Gamble. Somewhere in the top left-hand corner of South America lies the ruined basilica of Olena de Thina. It is, or rather was, a huge church, made all the more impressive because some time ago, ministries decided to build it on top of a high plateau surrounded by a range of tall, craggy mountains. A stunning place of heart-stopping views, it is easy to see why Olena de Thina was chosen as a location to worship God. But the honest residents of the town situated beneath the ruins have long forsaken it as a sacred site. The approach to the ruined basilica, once a well-tended sweeping lawn of coarse grass stretching for over 1.5 miles along the summit of the plateau, is now used as a landing strip for the occasional aircraft hopping stealthily over the mountain peaks. But no food, no clothing, medical supplies or tourists are shuttled in for the people of the town of Olena de Thina. In fact, any unwelcome plane or army helicopter might pass a mere 50 feet above the plateau and never know it was the location for a landing strip at all. So well disguised is it with fake boulders and synthetic bushes. For Olena de Thina is a place where some of the most dangerous people in the world ship out some of the most dangerous substances in the world to the rest of the world. Nestor Soto, or Nunu to his friends, of which he had very few, drew deeply on his expensive Cuban cigar and then threw the stub over the edge of the plateau. He watched the glowing end cartwheel and spin down the several hundred feet of cliff face to disappear in the darkness below. Nestor had seen many men tumble down the same cliff. He had thrown off a few of them himself, and if he had it his way tonight, at least one more shattered and crumpled body would be lying at the bottom of the cliff by the time dawn broke. Luis, said Nestor, speaking into his concealed microphone. You had better be in position ready. Si, General, Nestor's earpiece crackled back. Vincent. Si, General. Nestor went through the list of his 30 men hidden in and around the basilica ready to spring the ambush. They all chimed the same response. Emilio. Si, General. Mario. Si, Si, Nunu. Nestor clenched his fists and grimaced. Mario, when this is done tonight, you and I will have a serious chat. Again. Si, Nunu. Mario was Nestor's brother-in-law and the bane of his professional life as a drugs lord. But Nini, Nestor's wife, would only allow Nunu to punish her brother in the gentlest of fashions. If anyone else had dared make Nestor look weak and indecisive in front of his men, they would not be around for long to tell them of it. But Mario continued to do so under the protection of his sister, Nestor's own wife. What if Mario was accidentally shot tonight? Nestor considered the idea for a moment, but he knew Nini would find him out. Nestor sighed and gazed up into the sky. He wondered why the stars were wobbling this evening, probably high cloud. It was a pity. Nestor thought there was nowhere better on the planet to view stars. Nowhere better on the planet at all. The drone of a distant engine sounded, and Nestor turned towards the mountains to the north, but there was nothing to be seen. He hardly expected someone making the deal of this magnitude to advertise their presence to the authorities with wing lights, but normally he could make out the silhouette of the aircraft against the sky, even in twilight. "Okay, everyone," Nestor announced, addressing all of the hidden snipers with night sights, as well as the 6 men around him. "Nothing is to be done till Alvaro Garcia or his men until I light my first match, understand?" A chorus of "Si" echoed around the plateau, with one "Si Nunu" slightly after the others. Nestor Soto was a stout, balding man of fairly small stature who had survived until his mid-50s in a criminal business where most of the competition had either been murdered or were in prison. Nestor was doing well, and he knew it, but he was still glad of the 6 hulking men around him for protection. Alvaro Garcia would expect to see Nestor Soto with a small number of men. It would look suspicious if he did not appear to have any protection at all. Only a fool would attempt such a deal without any muscle whatsoever. "General," a voice crackled on Nestor's earpiece. "Who is it?" Nestor barked back. "Manuel, on the road," replied the sentry. "From his photograph, it is Alvaro Garcia. He is coming." "By road?" "Si, General. On a motorbike and sidecar." "A motorbike?" spluttered Nestor. This was unexpected. Alvaro Garcia was clearly playing by his own set of rules. "Any authorities following?" "No, General." "You are sure? Answer well now, your life depends on it, understand?" "Si, General." There was silence for a moment. "No one follows." "How many of them?" "2. "Alvaro Garcia approaches with one other," Nestor informed all his men. "They are on motorbike. Nothing has changed." The drugs lord took up his binoculars and followed the progress of the motorbike's headlamp, blazing through the town of Isla Lovecraft below, which was strangely empty of people. Nestor had heard of Alvaro Garcia, of course, and seen the photograph sent to him. There was not a single criminal on the continent who had not heard of Garcia's exploits in the audacious Santiago heist or the legendary Caracas caper. Millions had been stolen from 2 international companies that could afford to lose it, and no one had got so much as a paper cut in the escapades. Not long after, when untraceable millions of dollars were donated to orphanages and charities for the homeless in Bogota, Lima, La Paz, and Rio de Janeiro, Alvaro Garcia and his gang began to assume the status of folkloric heroes among the people of South America. Nestor did not mind this at all. Alvaro Garcia had not robbed him, and until now, the celebrated thief had not drifted into his line of business. Now, it seemed, Alvaro Garcia had turned his talents to narcotics. That was why Nestor felt he had to make an example of him for any other would-be drugs barons, even if the thief did have the guts to face him with the protection of only one man. Alvaro Garcia compensated for his oversteering as he came out of the corner, steadied the motorbike, smoothed down his mustache, and threw an apologetic glance at his passenger in the sidecar. He need not have bothered, for underneath the most improbable facial hair on the continent, Alvaro Garcia's companion, Kiki Segundo, had focused his mind to filter out the noise and movement of the vehicle in order to detect the slightest threat of danger. The deserted main street of Isla Lovecraft alarmed them both for its total lack of human movement. The place had all the hallmarks of a ghost town, with its tumble-down buildings, the despondent dirge of the bell in the basilica, the mangy dogs cowering in the doorways. But washing was strung up to dry in the high mountain winds, tables stood outside houses with unfinished hands of cards, and crude children's toys dotted the road, forcing the motorbike to slalom for fear of destroying them. Both men guessed that the real risks awaited them not from the poor, exploited people of the tower, but on top of the plateau before the basilica. As the motorbike strained up a section of the road possessed of a particularly steep gradient, a breeze tugged at their preposterous moustaches, making the hair quiver and tickle their cheeks. They both let their guards down for a moment and allowed themselves a grin at each other. In all honesty, one could hardly glance at the other without bursting out into laughter, so strange was their appearance to one another. Alvaro Garcia, with his uncommonly slight frame astride the fat, vintage motorbike, and his athletic companion with the handlebar moustache perched in the sidecar. Even during the precarious times of high criminality, they often found something to raise a laugh. Finally, emerging out of the neglected, forsaken streets of Isla Lovecraft, Alvaro Garcia pointed the chuttering motorbike and sidecar out onto the plateau, only to veer away from the group of men waiting for him there. An erratic session of driving followed, which did nothing to instill a sense of awe in Nestor Soto's gang. The motorbike headed on a collision course with a boulder, but swerved away at the last moment, allowing the passenger in the sidecar to swipe at it to reveal its plastic nature. Nestor Soto watched their antics with a masterly expression of arrogant indulgence, which he hoped did not portray his confusion inside. There was no doubt he was impressed by the fact that Alvaro Garcia had correctly guessed the true fabric of his boulders and bushes. No other visitor had. But he was somewhat short of impressed, insulted even, that anyone would be so foolish as to confront him effectively alone. Nestor sighed as he played between his fingers the match that was to signal the end of the outlaw now advancing towards him. Easing himself off the motorbike almost before it had sputtered to a halt, Alvaro Garcia approached the drug lord with his arm outstretched, as if they were old friends about to go for coffee and chew the fat. Nestor Soto was conscious that the passenger did not move from his position in the sidecar. No doubt he was heavily armed. It did not worry Nestor unduly. His men were professional enough to eliminate the serious threat first. In fact, looking at Alvaro Garcia, Nestor wondered how he could ever be considered a threat to anyone over the age of 10. "Good evening to you, Senor Soto," exclaimed Alvaro Garcia, grabbing Nestor's hand and pumping his arm. "That's some grip you have there, senor. I bet you can punch your weight and above. It is no wonder that they call you El Gallo de Pelea. Good evening, gentlemen." Nestor Soto wanted to explode with laughter at the tiny figure before him. How did he ever hope to get away with the outlandish mustachio, the female voice, and the feeble handshake in their line of business? What was crime coming to when this shabby little bottom dweller was allowed to swim with the sharks? "Call me Nestor. How may we help each other, Alvaro Garcia? I am honored that you should have asked to meet me. You have become a legend." Alvaro Garcia waved a hand dismissively, as if swatting an annoying fly. "Tackling a couple of one-off ventures is nothing. You have survived and thrived for 35 years in your profession. That shows true talent and wisdom, senor." For a moment, Nestor Soto ceased twirling the match in his hands. Something like a whiff of regret floated over his mind at the thought of having to kill this strange, respectful, stupid, brave figure. "I am here to advise you to get out of your profession, Nestor Soto," Alvaro Garcia continued. Nestor smiled. Well, at least they were talking his kind of business now. His fingers played the match between them once more. "I see. And why should I consider such a thing?" "You will accept such a thing because the deal I am about to offer you is the most richly paid and perilous you will ever undertake. If it goes well, you will be a stupidly rich man but in mortal danger for the rest of your life. You are used to that, I think. If it goes badly, you will be dead. There is no forward and no continuing on with your career after this deal. In fact, I wouldn't blame you for hiding from it." Nestor Soto used the wooden end of the match to pick at some invisible morsel of food between a canine and a molar. "If this is your ploy to grab my attention, Alvaro Garcia, it has succeeded. You have it." In the invisible flying craft hovering a mere couple of 100 feet above the activities on the plateau, Robbie looked on with fascination as Vasily finished supervising the last of the targeting. Back in the main body of the aircraft, 40 representatives of Sun, Dian, and Wanda's bodyguards reclined in special chairs that had been tilted in order to get better angles for their shots. They shouldered sleek, black rifles almost as long as their bodies, and every weapon was wired up with a single cable to a central power source fixed to the ceiling of the craft. All the bodyguards were donned in unique goggles that afforded them a shared vision of their targets. There was no need for windows on the hood because its passengers could just peer through the unique material that formed the sides of the craft as if there was nothing there at all. Therefore, with the goggles on, it seemed as if 60 sliver-thin blue targeting lines reached down from the sky to illuminate Nestor Soto's men hidden in and around the bacilla. Vasily held up a pair of goggles to his eyes to check, once again, that the bodyguards in the aircraft had covered every one of Nestor's snipers. Only then did he utter an innocuous "Fire." 40 rifle triggers were squeezed simultaneously and fired through the walls of the aircraft. Robbie observed absolutely nothing happen whatsoever. Something must have gone wrong with the technology, Robbie thought. But if so, why wasn't there panic in the aircraft? And why was Vasily sitting back in his chair with a contented expression spreading across his face? Grandma and Iva were exposed and vulnerable, and their excessive facial hair only made it easier for Nestor Soto's snipers to target them. "That's it?" asked Robbie. "That's it," echoed Vasily. "All gunmen but the bodyguards around Soto and one other is now useless to him." "Dead?" "No, not dead. Just, Vasily's left hand twirled around like a limp propeller, trying to generate the power for a correct translation. "Incapacitated is correct, yes? Put out of action?" "Yes." "We keep a dozen scrambler rifles on Soto's bodyguards just in case. Is standard procedure, but Ivor, he has the pride to take them on himself." "But the rifles didn't do anything." "So sorry, but they did," replied Madame Sun from the bank of seats behind him. "You must bear in mind, Robert, that these days the world is conquered quietly. A device does not need to bring about a spectacular effect to be effective. These rifles are weapons I have developed. In the West, they might be marketed as cynatic scramblers, but they are not on the market," she added emphatically, as Diane and Wanda leaned in closer to listen. "You have been taught that the brain communicates to the body through electrical signals transmitted along nerves in the spine, no doubt," continued Sun. "These weapons deliver a massive electrical pulse to disrupt or jam those signals for a short time. Nestor Soto's snipers have been rendered quite immobile for a short time, I can assure you. Robbie did not question his Aunt Sun. He had seen enough incredible sights on this one trip alone to understand that the world he lived in, the everyday reality for most people, now seemed a quaint and cosmetic as puppet theatre. Behind the three aunts, the pilot of the hood twisted in the inner frame of his huge tricircular gyroscope. It was difficult to discern the pilot at all, so immersed was he in various pieces of technology which broke up any human lines and took on the appearance of parasites latched onto their host. The vessel split up into two levels. The bottom section of the hull contained a second, smaller futuristic craft, while circling above it on a wide, luxurious gantry were the bodyguards, peering out through the near-invisible, shimmering walls at the scene below. Immediately after their launch, Robbie had watched in awe as the vessel effortlessly maneuvered through the entrance of the cavern beneath his grandma's house and out into the Avon Gorge. Robbie just had time to notice a couple of fireworks erupting above them. "Those rockets are ours, Robbie," his grandma had explained. Ivor was still livid about Robbie's inclusion on the mission and was not speaking to either of them at the time. "We automatically set off a couple of fireworks every time this craft leaves the cavern. The rockets emerge from a pipe just behind the tree line to explode above Clifton Observatory. It's a low-tech solution, I know, but it does take away any unwanted attention from the inevitable shimmering of the craft in the gorge. It never fails. Everybody turns to look at the fireworks." Then Bristol, the Avon Gorge, southern Wales and the West Country of England, and finally the British Isles receded into the distance at an astonishing speed. Robbie found it difficult to judge the most astonishing aspect of the trip. Certainly, venturing into space in a vessel with seemingly non-existent walls ranked as the most exhilarating experience of his life, although Robbie believed the shock of reaching up and out of the Earth's atmosphere had yet to sink in. This also meant that the aircraft had completed the trip from Bristol to the far side of South America in less than 2 hours. However, the space experience had competition. One of the most alarming and intriguing spectacles Robbie had ever witnessed was watching the physical transformations of Ivor and his grandma Gwen. Madame Sun, with about half a dozen of her own medical technicians, supervised the facial feature remapping operation, as she called it. "I've been working on Alvaro Garcia for touching on 4 years now. I quite look forward to reacquainting myself with the old rascal," Grandma Gwen explained, laying down in one of the adjustable seats in the compact medical bay just off from the hold of the aircraft, while technicians fussed around her. "Initially, he was simply a foothold in South America. This is Deanne's turf, really, but she cannot be expected to police all of the criminal activities on this continent. We barely oversee half of them now as it is. Sun and I decided to create an eccentric criminal personality and throw his weight around. Alvaro Garcia soon arrived, and my, did he shake a few branches. What a kerfuffle. It is not only the authorities who want him. You could make yourself millions in any currency by turning Alvaro over to any number of criminal gangs on this continent." "Please, remain still now, Gwen," advised Sun, who was personally supervising the operation. "Prepare yourself, sweetie," said Gwen, patting her grandson's hand. "When I get out of this contraption, I won't seem myself." In another part of the medical bay, a small team of technicians bustled around Ivor. He had adjusted his wheelchair to match the exact tilt of Gwen's own seat in order to standardize the operation, and lay there as docile and as trusting as a domestic dog while the medical personnel rigged him up for the change. The moment 2 large identical pieces of equipment were rolled forward by the scientific team, Ivor turned to face Robbie, winked, his mouth flinched in a regretful smile, and then he set his head back against the rest with unnatural rigidity. The drone of an electronically controlled mechanism heralded the slow creep forward of two metal shapes, roughly resembling oversized oranges, with a couple of segments missing. Each metallic orange glinted and winked in the internal lights of the aircraft, revealing itself to be an array of thousands of ultra-fine needles. These descended upon the faces of Gwen and Ivor and seemed to devour their heads. Robbie watched with gruesome fascination as the ghost images of his grandma and his friend appeared in the relief patterns of displaced needles. A couple of monitors on a wall ran through a stream of data and then stopped on the images of two shaggy individuals. The names beneath one image read Gwen Carroll / Alvaro Garcia. The other picture boasted Ivor Noon / Kiki Segundo. Robbie barely had time to read the names before the fine needles began to quiver, then ripple in waves, and Robbie dreaded to think what they might be doing to the faces underneath them. Madame Sun tried her hand at a comforting remark. Some of what you are witnessing are syringes injecting specific chemicals into specific muscles or stimulating temporary rampant follicle growth, but much of this is a form of acupuncture. It is a Chinese method and very ancient. In so many ways, the Chinese have always been ahead of their time. Deanne and Wanda threw Sun an identical glare that seemed to suggest amusement and contempt all at the same time, without even having to adjust the tilt of an eyebrow. "You may think yourself ahead of us, scientist girl," said Deanne, "but that only makes it easier for us to kick your backside when you falter." For the first time that evening, Deanne and Wanda shared a smile at Sun's expense. In that one exchange, Robbie instantly received a clearer understanding about the group dynamics of the Mona Lisas, and he shuddered at the thought of how much it reminded him of the school playgrounds he had known. 10 minutes later, the metallic needle machines drew back from their grotesque embrace. In the place where Gwen Carroll and Ivor Noon had been were two extremely hairy men who would not have looked out of place as roadies for some thrash heavy metal band. To all intents and purposes, Robbie's grandmother had transformed into the man, Alvaro Garcia. "It is me, sweetie," came Grandma Gwen's voice from the mouth of the hairy gentleman. Well, Robbie thought, surely by anybody's standards, this has to rank as an unusual day. "So, Senor Garcia, permit me to recap the details of this deal," said Nestor Soto, theatrically turning towards his group of half a dozen bodyguards who were sniggering like a pack of schoolboys at the back of a class. "You will provide me with several thousand kilos of the product, which, from the sample you have offered me, appears to be genuine and of fine quality." With each remembered point, Nestor Soto swung the matchstick in his hand like a conductor with a baton. "You will also supply me with transportation, the means to run it, and a safe access point into the United States. This is very charitable, senor. Truly, the generosity of Alvaro Garcia runs deep." Gwen Carroll, in the guise of Alvaro Garcia, beamed back personably. Behind this figure sat the outrageously mustachioed Ivor Noon in the persona of Kiki Segundo, who was calculating how fast he could vault out of the sidecar and engage the bodyguards. Nestor Soto was closest to Gwen, but appeared to carry nothing more harmful than a match. The man's muscle would have to be tackled first. "In return, I am to... what? Remind me, Mona de la Fuente." A swarthy, brutal bodyguard could hardly get the words out through his broad smile as he repeated the deal. "You are to provide a person to pilot this vehicle and use your own networks to distribute it throughout North America, Europe, and the rest of the world. It seems to be a very fortunate deal for us, does it not, gentlemen? The 6 men laughed openly and uttered in unison, Si, General. Do I look 3 years old, Mono de la Fuente? No, General. Maybe I look like I've tumbled to Earth from Mars only yesterday. No, General. Mono de la Fuente, you are wrong, because the legendary Alvaro Garcia expects me to join him in this deal. Therefore, I must be an alien or a nursing child to give the appearance of being so gullible and stupid. You do not have to join me in this deal, Nestor Soto, replied Alvaro Garcia. I can always take my business to Daniel Vargas. Vargas is nothing but an upstart Judas, seethed Nestor Soto, all remnants of good humor having vanished in a second. I bring him up from the street, train him, let him sleep in my house, eat at my table, become my lieutenant and heir apparent, and how is Nestor Soto repaid? By Vargas setting himself up as competition. But you will do ill, Alvaro Garcia, if you deal with him. Vargas will not be part of this world for long. Nestor Soto took a moment to marshal some composure. Forgive me, senor, no mockery now. Please explain why you would want to offer me this huge quantity of product at no cost. For you to sell it at such ridiculously low rates that it will destroy the rest of the competition. It is not a new idea, I think, explained Alvaro Garcia. The competition will feed on each other, destroy themselves, but you will still be rich, leaving only you and I left to deal. A monopoly on the market? Indeed. But they will hold me accountable and kill me. I shan't tell them, but if they do find out, I am sure the great Nestor Sato, El Gallo do Palais, the fighting cock himself, will take care of his own business. That is the hidden cost. Nestor Soto considered the idea for a few moments. For a deal to be agreed, we must all shake hands. I should like to see your hands, senor, Nestor asked Kiki Segundo, who was still sat in the sidecar. Ivan Noon, in the guise of Kiki Segundo, waited for a nod from Alvaro Garcia, then slowly placed his pale hands on top of the shell of the sidecar. Nestor seemed pleased, and placed the match behind his ear. It is an interesting proposition, Alvaro Garcia, replied Nestor. But, senor, I think I shall take the rest of the product that is in the sidecar of your motorcycle and count myself lucky. Mona de la Fuente, as from this evening, make Alvaro Garcia a myth. Nestor Soto had barely finished uttering the word myth when a trio of guns belonging to the bodyguards around him were instantly trained on the sidecar. But the figure of Kiki Segundo had not reacted at all. And now, although neither Nestor Soto nor Mono de la Fuente could have been aware of it, the 3 gunmen were no longer able to react to anything either. Madame Sun's synaptic scramblers had silently ensured that the men were no longer on speaking terms with their own brains. They had become about as useful to their boss as statues. Vasily knows his job, Gwen Carroll thought to herself. Iva was also thinking quickly. 3 taken out already. Mental note, not to be too upset with Vasily for the intervention. 3 more bodyguards, 2 on either side of Soto. Should be in front of their client, sloppy, probably family rather than professionals. Other man pulling a knife. He's bigger, older, approximately 17 stone. Soto himself still seems to be unarmed. Gwen needs to move back somewhere beside or behind me. No cause for alarm yet. They think they have the upper hand. Thank you, friends, for not shooting them, said Mono de la Fuente, slapping a hand on one of the gunmen. But in the near dark he did not notice that the bodyguard was rigid and not even blinking. Mona de la Fuente's teeth flashed in the twilight as he reached into a sheath strapped onto his belt and pulled out a large combat knife. "You spoiled me." The light was now so dim that the dull black blade of the knife might have been a slice of darkness. Gwen Carroll, as Alvaro Garcia, stepped back beside the sidecar. "You first, Alvaro Garcia, or your man. Makes no difference," said Nestor Soto. Mona de la Fuente sucked his teeth in reproach. "You should have been quicker, senor," he said, wagging a finger at Kiki Segundo. "Your mustachio slows you down, maybe, yes?" Gwen Carroll began her rehearsed lines. "You would kill unarmed men who came to stretch out the hand of comradeship?" asked Alvaro Garcia with mock distress. "This is how you do business, Nestor Soto?" "Senor, only last month some school vehicles full of children were destroyed at my hands," boasted Mona de la Fuente as he strode towards the motorbike. "So, if you think I give," he clicked his fingers, "about your deaths, allow me to prove you wrong." Gwen Carroll glanced at her companion in the sidecar. "Ivor, don't," she whispered, breaking character for a moment and speaking English. "What?" Mona de la Fuente barked back. Even with the descending dark and even under the disguise of Kiki Segundo, Gwen recognized Ivor's look. Her intention had been that there should be no deaths tonight, but by bragging about the destruction of the school buses and the killing of the children within them, Mona de la Fuente had sealed his own fate. Up in the invisible aircraft, the passengers were concentrating upon the hairy Latin American version of Ivor. Everyone but the pilot was following events with unblinking scrutiny. The bodyguards also had a professional interest in studying and learning how Ivor would deal with the situation. An overhead view was not the ideal way to see the action. This was not a cinema, after all, and it would do for their purposes. Then it happened. Ivor was up and out of the sidecar with ferocious speed. The figure with the knife seemed to be distracted by Alvaro Garcia when the attack came, offering Ivor a split-second advantage. From 200 feet above the plateau, it was hard to make out clearly what was occurring, but Ivor appeared to launch himself off the sidecar. Then he swung around his opponent's body, pivoting on the neck, completing 3/4 of a turn before taking on 2 other bodyguards. Robbie watched confused as the figure with the knife remained standing for a second. Then the figure swayed, crumpled and folded like a cloth doll, his head landing in a twisted position that was quite impossible for anyone living. It seemed obscene, Robbie thought, at how quickly a human life could be extinguished. Nestor Soto was running, or something like it. His limbs barely remembered the movements, for they had not so much as broken out into a trot for 20 years. Nestor was used to living with fear. Fear of a sniper among the bushes in the garden. Fear of an incendiary device every time a car sparked into life. Fear of literally being stabbed in the back by one of his men. But this was a different quality of fear. It had the character and it had the scent of being hunted. "Why weren't the 3 bodyguards with the guns doing anything?" Nestor mumbled to himself as he glanced back at the silhouettes of his 3 motionless men, their guns still in their outstretched hands. Nestor's 2 remaining bodyguards were trying to engage with the strange, dark figure that dipped, vaulted, and swung from man to man in a form of fighting neither of them had ever experienced. From a little distance and in the falling light, Nestor tried to drive the thought from his head that this adversary might not be human at all. After some scrabbling around in his pockets, Nestor remembered that the match was behind his ear. He stopped, flicked the match against a tiny strip of sandpaper on his fingernail, and watched the flame flare up in near darkness as the phosphorus ignited. Nestor held it aloft like a torchbearer, knowing that the action would draw attention to his position, but his secret gunmen were his only hope now. And yet, the twilit plateau showed no indication of any snipers. No muzzle flash, no crack of bullets breaking the sound barrier. Even the silence of night seemed astonished. It did not take long for the silence to become ominous. The wind hissed through the coarse grass of the high plateau. The stars seemed cold and remote. Olenna Dithina, the place Nestor loved so much, the very bacilla where he and his beloved Nini had been married, the plateau from where the plane had taken off to take them on their honeymoon tour of the continent, all of it now became alien and threatening to him. The only silhouettes Nestor could make out against the horizon were the 3 still gunmen, the motorbike, and Alvaro Garcia. No one else had been left standing. Nestor Soto guessed he had been left alone to face the diminutive figure of Alvaro Garcia, as well as the army of muscle that must have taken out all of Nestor's best men. It was some consolation to Nestor that he was going to meet his end up here, in this most precious part of the country he adored. Alvaro Garcia revved up the motorbike once more, just as Nestor felt a strong, agile force scale his body. The weight of the man, or the thing, on his back brought the stout drugs lord to his knees. Nestor felt a hand reach around and grip a specific point on his throat, which made his pulse beat wildly beneath the unknown fingers. These fingers then tilted his head upward. Above them, a sleek, shining skycraft of a type Nestor had never seen before suddenly emerged from the fabric of the night. It glided down onto the plateau with almost no noise. A square fracture appeared in the hull that showed itself to be a door, which, in turn, became a ramp as it tilted down towards the earth. From out of the belly of the ship strode a group of individuals who appeared to be missing large segments of their bodies. Coasting along between them was a futuristic-looking vessel of about 25 feet long. Nestor Soto recognized what the smaller craft might be, but also believed he was witnessing an alien visitation. Carefully planting the new vessel on the plateau, the individuals with the missing bodies retrieved the discreet lift that had carried it and marched it back into the skycraft. "You see, Nestor Soto, you really are out of your depth," declared Alvaro Garcia above the throaty chortle of the motorbike engine. "We can accomplish such things beyond your dreams, El Gallo de Pele. You are a mere fighting cock amongst gladiators and predators, no match. I know you will keep our deal, or we will visit you one final time." Nestor was hardly aware that the match was burning the tip of his fingers. He watched the motorbike and sidecar rumble out of his field of view to somewhere behind him. The grip on his throat was released, and the weight sprang off his back. Nestor stared with helpless, childlike wonder as the headlamp of the motorbike swept up the ramp of the skycraft and vanished. In the next moment, the whole aircraft appeared to dissolve into the night, leaving only a tug of wind and a rippling shimmer across the stars. "Nunu," a voice cracked over the earpiece. "My gun! It does not appear to be working." "How has Alvaro Garcia been able to take out all of my men except the harmless fool with the replica rifle who I really wanted killed?" Nestor said out loud as he rose to his feet. "Mario. Si, Nunu. You're an idiot." "Si, Nunu." This really was a night of education for Nestor Soto. He had just learned that he was not the biggest fish in the ocean. He was a dogfish hunting around a wreck or a rock pool, given grace to do so by the huge hunters coming in on the tide. And now he was left with a submarine full of illegal drugs on top of a high mountain plateau while his men lay unconscious around him. A submarine. How was he ever going to get the submarine down the mountain? And how was he ever going to find someone to pilot a submarine? Then a thought occurred to Nestor. You like the sea, Mario. See, Nunu. It seems I may have a use for you after all.
Chapter 12. The Fortune Teller and the Bodyguard. The journey from South America back to Bristol was when Robbie lost all sense of direction, and it had nothing to do with the flight. Aside from his mother, Grandma Gwen and Ivor Noon had been the only constants in Robbie's life, his true north. But witnessing his grandmother force the drug deal on the plateau, which could potentially bring misery to thousands, and spectating on Ivor's casual ruthlessness as he murdered the henchman, had destroyed the compass inside Robbie. Nothing could ever be taken for granted again. He was lost. Who was he to depend on now? Did he truly know anyone? His rudderless mind lurched between 100 different fond memories of his family and the disorientating events of the night with all the questions they provoked. In less than half a day, Robbie's world had shifted and warped into a version of itself he had little hope of understanding, leaving him unsure of everything and everyone. Even though they were sat beside each other on the flying craft, Robbie and Ivor had not even exchanged glances, let alone spoken to one another since the bodyguard had returned from the facial remapping procedure to restore his default features. In a vessel brimming with people, they both seemed utterly isolated. "Why?" Robbie eventually asked, his face almost turned to his friend's direction. It took several seconds for Ivor to surface from his thoughts. "Sorry? Why did you do it?" "He had a knife." "The other henchmen had guns." "But they were taken care of. He was going to kill us," Ivor replied as if weary. "Yet you didn't kill his boss?" "No." "So his bodyguard was disposable?" Ivor drew in a deep breath and expelled it in a sigh. "Molo de la Fuente deserved to die. He had form." "Form?" "A history of crime, a reputation. And his boss didn't. We needed him. The Mona Lisas needed him." "So Grandma asked you to kill him?" "No. I chose to kill the man." "Why?" "I have my own reasons, but I do not wish to share them." It was clear that Ivor had become riled by the concentrated volley of questions aimed at the same target, the same bruise, the same wound that was turning raw with the attention. All Robbie knew was that he was seeking to provoke a reaction, although he would never be able to explain why. The events over the last hours were so dominating all his thoughts that Robbie experienced the extreme physical sensations of shedding the world's atmosphere to enter space as little more than a particularly interactive computer game. With one half of the earth below them in darkness, Robbie turned to look towards the stars through the near invisible walls of the hood, barely aware of how ferociously they shone without the competition from the hidden sun. He stared with blank focus as he composed his next question. "Has Grandma asked you to kill before?" For the first time since he had left the vessel to back up Gwen Carroll in her drug deal, Ivor turned to stare at Robbie. "I understand that this is all new to you, and I know that tonight will be bewildering. But what do you think my job entails, Robbie?" "To protect Grandma," Robbie said defiantly. "But I saw you tackle that Sergei in the kitchen. You're quick and strong. You didn't have to kill that man." "None of us here have clean hands," explained Ivor as if he were trying to explain a theory to a particularly dim student. "Not me, not your grandmother, not your aunts. No one here but you." "What does that mean? You're not just criminals, but killers?" "Killing is one of the complications attached to this profession," replied Ivor coldly. "Complications? Complications!" Robbie heard himself yelling without experiencing it. The apparent slow drift of the craft, which was actually approaching several thousand miles an hour, as well as the profound silence of space, seemed to amplify the shout. Everyone but the pilot of the hood turned in Robbie's direction. The worst crime, the worst sin in the world is not a complication. Murder is not a complication. "Amen," exclaimed Deanne Walker from her seat at the front of the vessel, and there was something passionate, even manic, in the delivery of the comment. Deanne's remark immediately drew attention away from Robbie and Ivor, as Gwen Carroll, Wanda Silvano, and Sun Ji concentrated their conversation upon the fourth Mona Lisa sat beside them. "There are worse crimes than killing a bad man," Ivor pronounced in what was supposed to be a whisper but resembled a hiss. "Do you know anything of Mona de la Fuente's history? Do you have the slightest notion of what he has committed?" "No, Ivor, but I'm beginning to suspect I know nothing about what you've done either, or Grandma," pronounced Robbie. "Mona de la Fuente would have slit our throats in a church full of praying children, then turned his knife on the kids without having a shadow of a scruple trouble his conscience. Well, he died by his own rules and he lived with that risk, save your concern for people who were worth it." Irritation and rage were taking hold of Ivor like venom coursing through his veins. "I told your grandmother you should not have come tonight." "Yet, here I am, and there you are, whoever you are." "Your father was a killer, Robbie," spat Ivor. "He was good at it too, one of the best they say, and he died because of it. Let's hope it's not a hereditary trait, shall we?" The drubbing of his friend had been effective, producing the reaction Robbie was searching for, but Ivor's single swipe had dealt all Robbie's arguments a mortal blow. Even though everyone had been asked to remain in their seats in case the ship's internal gravity failed, Robbie slowly fumbled open the buckle on his harness and stumbled away from his oldest friend. His mind could find nothing familiar to latch onto. This was a lawless outland, unmapped territory with strange, sinister, and frightening natives. "You should not have come tonight," Ivor muttered, turning his face towards the stars in shame. "I never knew you at all," Robbie managed to utter. Ivor's eyes darted about as if hunting for an answer in the constellations. "I never knew you at all, did I?" The cry caused the passengers of the Mona Lisa to face Ivor and Robbie once more. Even the Mona Lisas, secluded at the front of the flying vessel and deep in conversation with Deanne, turned towards them. "You were my best friend," Robbie continued to cry out. Ivor's glare locked onto Gwen Carroll's eyes and remained fixed there. "A kid like you should have friends his own age." Robbie's stare might have bored a hole through Ivor's temple. "Up until tonight, you, Mum, and Grandma have been everything to me. Robbie glanced out into space for inspiration. "My star guides. The only people I could rely upon to steer me towards becoming a person I liked and wanted to be. And up until that moment, that comment then, you were the only adult, the only one who never, ever treated me as a child at any time. I'll do my growing up alone from now on." Ivor turned his face back towards the relentless gaze of the stars. "Go away, Robbie." All around the ship, the bodyguards tended to remain in the company of their own groups, preferring not to get to know people they might possibly be asked to turn upon one day on a given signal. But Sergei was a new recruit, so was unaware of these unspoken routines and customs. The immense Mongolian was sat on his own, gazing open-mouthed with childlike wonder at the eternal night in most of the 360 degrees around him. As soon as Robbie had stepped away from Ivor, however, he beckoned at the boy to take the empty seat beside him. Robert, here, yes," Sergei called out, patting the seat beside him as if it was a pet used to rough affection. If Robbie's mind had been operating rationally, he might have shunned the invitation of the bodyguard who had scared him witless on the stairs only a few hours before, even though it seemed a lifetime away now. But Robbie only wanted to be away from Ivor, so gladly took the proffered seat and strapped himself in beside the Mongolian. "Sit, yes, sit with me, please." Sergei nodded. "You and I, we are fresh to such things, yes? It is good to have company when new things happen. You are angry with Evolf over killing, yes?" Robbie made no sign. "I know where you are arriving from, yes?" Sergei nodded. "It was the same with me when I shot my first wolf. Understand, I had flushed out wolves from the forest before. We go amongst trees, making great rumpus hell of hullabaloo. My uncle fires. The shot seems to echo off the mountains. The wolf that had taken our animals lies dead." Robbie made no response, happy to occupy his mind with the Mongolian's ramblings and knowing that, in his own way, Sergei was attempting to help. "You have seen Khan Kenti?" asked the Mongolian. Robbie shook his head. "It is a harsh, simple land to the north of my country, Robbie. I call you Robbie, is okay?" Robbie nodded his head. "Plains, forests, and the mountains. Only this." He pointed to the starscape around him. "Makes me feel smaller." Sergei appeared to become lost in the glory of the stars once more, and for a few seconds, Robbie thought he had been forgotten about. "I was 6 when my uncle gave me the rifle." "Didn't your father teach you to shoot?" asked Robbie. Sergei looked surprised, considered the question for a moment, and then decided to answer it. "Like you, I think I never knew my father," Sergei explained quietly, as if hoping not to share his history with anyone but Robbie. "He was a European traveler, German, I think, who met my mother in Ulaanbaatar. Business, pleasure, who knows. My uncle was my father growing up. He is a good man. Treated me as son." Robbie sensed he had strayed into the huge Mongolian's most vulnerable recollections. "I did not know my mother for long either before she left," Sergei added. The silence after the comment had a weight to it, suggesting a significant portion of a childhood was carried along with it. "Where did she go?" Robbie asked gently, sensing he was supposed to ask. "She left," Sergei stated firmly, closing that avenue of questioning. "My uncle gave me good childhood, though. Maybe my parents did me favor," Sergei mused. "And your father? What of him?" "I'm not sure," replied Robbie. "I was told he died in an accident before I was born, but I don't know anymore." Sergei nodded. "This is a bummer." Robbie smiled at the Mongolian's comment, relieved that his emotions had found humor as an outlet rather than tears. "I interrupted you. Your uncle handed you the rifle and—" "Yes, my uncle handed me rifle. I sighted her. It was only an old she-wolf with torn ears. I wept for her that night and hated my uncle for days. But never again. The first killing is the worst, always." "He was a man, Sergei," said Robbie. "The person Ivor killed tonight was a man." "No, he was wolf. Not all of them wear wolf skin, you see?" Robbie considered this for a moment. "You knew him?" "No, but I can tell." declared Sergei, nodding sagely. I am like bird watcher of men, yes? I can tell a hawk from a crow, and this man was predator. Bad wolf. Robbie's smile broadened. What type of animal am I then, Sergei? You are golden eagle, like Sergei. Alone, powerful, he said, kissing his mountainous bicep. And magnificent to witness, yes? Robbie's grin morphed into a smile, and Sergei joined him. You and I are new to this, repeated the Mongolian. Big learning for both of us tonight, yes? Robbie agreed, and gratefully allowed Sergei to talk about his homeland all the way back to Bristol. Only the Hood's re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere interrupted the Mongolian's almost continuous stream of description and reminiscence until Robbie half believed that not only had he visited Khan Kenti, the province of Mongolia, but that he might have grown up there himself. Even after the aircraft had touched down in the caverns set within the cliffs of the Avon Gorge, and they had all disembarked, Robbie remained with Sergei. Then he said his goodbyes, saving the fondest for the big Mongolian, and retreated to the room kept aside for him at his grandmother's house. Few people would have noticed his absence anyway. The Mona Lisas were having a quick debate on the South American deal back in Gwen Carroll's study, whilst the bodyguards prepared to leave Bristol. High up in the house, Robbie heard the building rapidly hemorrhaging people, but sleep had overcome him by the time Gwen Carroll found the opportunity to look in on her grandson. It was the middle of the morning when Robbie awoke to hear his grandmother on the phone to her daughter, Ellie Ash. What had become a discreet call was becoming more strident with every exchange. "No, sweetie, for the 5th time he came running to us of his own volition," explained Grandma Gwen to her daughter. "I can understand you were frantic, sweetie, but I was busy last night and have yet to talk to him about why he ran away." "I don't think Robbie's talking to anyone at the moment." "Yes, I understand." Sweetie, the wonderful thing about the phone is that you can both listen to the other person as well as talk to them. Otherwise, it's just a broadcast." "Well, sweetie, I have issues with your husband-to-be too. But when have you ever listened to me, even in a phone call?" Eavesdropping in on the conversation, Robbie was certain that he would never get used to the idea of his grandmother being the criminal mastermind, the fortune-teller. Her life, her concerns, her contentment seemed so domestic and harmless. "No, sweetie, sweetie, sweetie. I'm going to put down the receiver now, and we'll see you in Chuffing Sodmore around lunchtime. Get some rest now, sweetie. You don't sound at all well." "Okay, I'm sure you will. Bye-bye now." It could hardly be said that Robbie was keen to return to Chuffing Sodmore, but he did not object to the idea any more either. He had run away as one person and would return as another. Unfortunately, he could not orientate himself around his own feelings towards his grandmother and his best friend without experiencing all manner of conflicting emotions. His attitude towards his family had changed seismically, and Robbie felt the need to put some distance, as well as time, between himself and these two people to contemplate if he wanted these familiar strangers back in his life. After the experiences of the previous night, Gabriel Sage was hardly something to look forward to, but he certainly seemed the lesser of two evils. A little while later, Robbie was ready and reconciled to be driven back to Chuffing Sodmore when Grandma Carroll invited her grandson into the large, empty kitchen. A chair had been pulled out beside her, but he shunned it in preference for having a corner of the huge kitchen table between himself and his grandmother. On the table between them was a small black box that might have held cufflinks or a hearing aid. Robbie was intrigued by the box, but did not succumb to the temptation of opening it. "The car will leave in 10 minutes, sweetie," she declared. "I'm sure you can fill up that time with questions you want to ask me." Robbie just shrugged and allowed his gaze to wander around the table. "Very well, I shall set the ball rolling. What you witnessed last night was indeed a drug deal, and yes, Ivor did kill that man." Robbie made no reaction. His gaze had come to light upon a pattern of concentric ovals clustered around a knot in the table. "Is this the last deal the Mona Lisas will conduct?" Gwen Carroll continued. "Absolutely not. We have a bigger, more dangerous venture planned in a few months. Part of me would like you to be there." "And will more people die because of your actions?" asked Robbie, without looking at his grandmother. "Undoubtedly they will, yes," she answered, "both as a consequence of last night's deal and the forthcoming one, but not in the way you might imagine. I cannot say more than that the deal is not what it seems to be. Now, clearly you're upset with—" "It doesn't matter," Robbie interrupted her. "You'll do that mind wipe trick on me again and I'll be the docile, loving grandson once more." "Is that what you want?" "No, of course not." "Then I won't. I give you my word." "You're a criminal, Grandma. You trade in lies. Your word, your promises, don't count for anything." Gwen Carroll nodded as if in agreement. "Then all I'll say to you is to read the newspapers or listen to the wireless or watch the television news coverage in about a fortnight to a month's time, particularly regarding criminal activity in North and Central America." She peered up at the ceiling for a moment, then added as an afterthought, "And Europe. You will see the true effects of last night's undertaking, the true effects of what the Mona Lisas have started." "Let the newspapers and television do your boasting for you," Robbie said, finally meeting his grandmother's gaze. "If that's what you want to believe, but that is not what drives us." Gwen Carroll paused. "Are you going to tell your mother?" "Mum doesn't know about any of this?" replied Robbie incredulously. "She chose hypnosis over the knowledge." Robbie was stunned. "Doesn't she even know about Dad?" "Nothing." Gwen Carroll stared at her only grandchild with disconcerting intensity. "Will you tell her?" Robbie met her gaze but remained silent for a short time. "What would I say? She doesn't even believe me over Sage. How could she believe this?" "No, Grandma, I won't tell on you." Gwen Carroll appeared satisfied and opened the lid of the small box on the table, placing it in front of Robbie. Inside was a leather cord necklace with a small black metal bead at its center, the type of thing a surfer might wear. Beside it, cushioned in a carefully designed red velvet indentation, was a minuscule round black dot. "Believe it or not, sweetie, these two accessories act as a communication device," declared Gwen Carroll. "The bead on the necklace is a microphone transmitter, similar to the Tektite choker I wear, and the black thingamajig is a tiny speaker, which you place inside the shell of your ear where it masquerades as a skin mole. Together, they form a loop, allowing you to contact us like a telephone. All you have to do is to squeeze the bead until you hear an electronic note, and you'll automatically get through to us. Soon tells me that this is a possible way forward for mobile phones, apparently, although her people are still working on how to input phone numbers and call-up options, something concerning interactive contact lenses and retina tracking. I can't follow it. There is even a way to have these surgically implanted, should you want to. I confess most of Sun's paraphernalia is beyond me. Try it." "I shan't need it." "I understand. Well, take it anyway, should you want us to intervene with Gabriel Sage for you." It took a moment for Robbie to recognize the significance of the comment. In that moment, did he really have the power to end the life of a man who so captivated his mother? Could he, with casual irresponsibility, ask for Gabriel Sage to be executed? Is that what his grandmother was asking? Was she using the word intervene in the same way that Ivor had used complications to mean murder? Was this how inconvenient people were dealt with in the criminal world of the Mona Lisas? Was life so valueless? Robbie had no idea if this was what his grandmother meant, but the weight of the idea made him nauseous. "Is there anything else you want to discuss with me now?" Gwen Carroll asked. "If you ask me to, I will make overtures to your mother about returning here to live with us, if you so wish it." "No, there's nothing," replied Robbie, rejecting everything he had hoped for when he had escaped the museum the night before. "I just want to go home to Mum." At around lunchtime, the day after the evening of the drug deal in South America, Robbie was reinstalled in Chuffing Sodmore's Museum of Phantasmagoria, having hardly spoken a word in the car journey on the way back. As soon as Ivor turned the car around the statue of the soldier in the village square and the brown-eyed girl, Isla Lovecraft, sat beneath it, Robbie jumped out and greeted his mother in a surrendering embrace. He could tell by the frailty in his mother's hug that Robbie's running away had taken its toll on her physically, but Ellie Ash would not let him go for a full minute. "Please, never again," she sobbed. "Please, please, promise me." "I'm sorry, Mum," Robbie whispered, his tearful eyes catching sight of Gabriel Sage's face, which appeared to be bearing an expression of genuine anxiety. "It was all new to me. I'm going nowhere from now on." "Not now. Not now," she replied. "We'll talk more tomorrow, you and I. Go and rest." Robbie did as he was told, and never glanced back at the fortune teller and her bodyguard. Not even once. Chapter 13. The Gladiators. Throughout the rest of the day, Robbie gladly kept himself in the small stone chamber that only the most devout monk might ever comfortably refer to as a bedroom. But Robbie was grateful for the solitude it offered. Thoughts and feelings about his grandma and Ivor bonded like chemical compounds in the furious furnace of his mind, until Robbie did not know if he was reacting to the memories of his family or the conflict of emotions they provoked in him. Sometime after lunchtime, after Gwen Carroll and Ivor Noon had departed, Robbie had his face turned towards the stone wall when he heard someone enter the room. "Robert! Robert? Are you with us?" Gabriel Sage whispered. Preferring to feign sleep than face anyone, especially his soon-to-be stepfather, Robbie made no answer. There was silence, pacing, and then the door was pulled shut once more. Standing on top of the coarse, splinter-ridden tea chest beside the bed was a steaming mug of tea. Robbie eyed it suspiciously, not knowing what the drink symbolized. Was it a declaration of peace, or a gesture of kindness forced upon Gabriel Sage by his fiancée? Hardly having touched breakfast, however, Robbie was glad of something to occupy his stomach and, as soon as it was cool enough to drink, he downed the liquid and returned to the siege of his thoughts. As the day drew on, Robbie became aware that there was continual and frenetic activity somewhere in the museum. On most days of the week, this would have made no impression on anyone living in the museum, but it was Saturday, and the builders never worked at a weekend. The constant hammering became a beat to Robbie's own thoughts, which had become stuck in a loop, as he replayed the events of the previous night over and over again. Occasionally, a scenario would creep up on him, suggesting that his grandmother might be acting secretly on behalf of some government organization as a force for good, someone who had been chosen for some unfathomable reason to infiltrate some of the world's most dangerous gangsters. "The deal is not what it seems to be," she had said. "You will see the true effects of last night's undertaking, the true effects of what the Mona Lisas have started." But what did that mean? Robbie began to explore any possibility that hinted at decent, ethical alternatives, no matter how remote. He would eagerly work through any idea, leaping from one improbable branch to another, until the last twig of reason snapped under the weight of the idea, and he fell back down to the root of the truth. His grandmother and aunts were the heads of a criminal underworld. Only a single sliver of hope glimmered in Robbie's mind. Maybe Ellie Ash had fought her way through the hypnotism and somehow guessed at Grandma Gwen's activities. Maybe his mother's intuition had always tried to protect her son from Gwen and Ivor by always putting distance between him and them. Robbie's mind was still spinning around in his insanity-inducing loop when Gabriel Sage burst in on him. "What time is it?" Robbie asked. "Late. They've just closed the doors of the Bog Digger's Arms," declared Gabriel Sage, beneath half-lidded eyes perched upon a gently swaying head. "I say closed, but the old mongrels of the establishment are having a late-night lock-in after-hours drinking session, if you will. Was made crystal clear to me that I wasn't damn well invited. To hell with them." Gabriel Sage lurched around to face the rough direction of the pub and bellowed at the wall. "To hell with you! Blame those slacker builders for poisoning the village against me. They see this stuff here, their puny minds and tawdry taste have no hope of appreciating. They don't understand. Simple as that. I have the ability to bring fame to this shabby little settlement, and the reflected glory could have been theirs, and not one of them has the vision to see it. That's the flaming museum out there with them, not in here with my dynamic and unique work." Sage lurched around once more to face the offending wall. "To hell with them, and thrice damn all to filthiest stinky-ass pit of hell. May all your beer be warm and taste of urine. The devil has his own lock-in, you know, and they're all invited." Robbie began to wonder if Gabriel Sage was about to take out his drunken resentment on someone whose life he could make a living hell. "Thank you for the tea," Robbie ventured with a pacifying remark. "What are you talking about? Oh, yes. Welcome and all that. Can't have you wasting away, can we? What would your mother say?" The deep stone walls threw out a chill into the room, causing Robbie to reach for the extraordinary coat with the unique functions, but it was to be found nowhere in the room. "If you're looking for your coat, by the way, I've confiscated it. Find it hard to run away again without it, won't you?" exclaimed Sage. Suddenly, the cup of tea made sense to Robbie, although he was surprised his soon-to-be stepfather would even bother to create an excuse to enter the room and take anything he fancied. The flamboyant man suddenly went ominously quiet, staring blearily at Robbie, swaying like a high branch in a stiff wind and narrowing the tips of his moustache in the manner of an old-fashioned villain. Robbie found the silence uncomfortable in the extreme. "Are we back on the road tomorrow?" Robbie asked. "No, you can sleep during the day or do whatever your mother has planned for you," said Gabriel Sage. "Thanks, but I had a fair amount of rest today," said Robbie, rubbing his eyes and stretching. "Although I don't really feel the benefit of it." "Well, benefit or not,
We're working tonight. What? What do you want with me tonight?
I believe you've the vision, Robert, declared Gabriel Sage in an extravagant whisper.
Don't know what all that silly nonsense was about running back to your grandmother's. Disappointed in you. Had such high hopes for you. Was mulling over whether I should offer you the Flavian.
Gabriel Sage lurched out of the door before he finished uttering the last words. Robbie was feeling lightheaded and ravenous, but after a minute was intrigued enough to follow his soon-to-be stepfather out of the bedroom and into the cottages of the museum. The only lights on in the buildings were those in the display cases, which illuminated the museum in haunting pockets of glowing stillness. Gabriel Sage was nowhere to be seen. As Robbie crept through the cottages, his eyes were inevitably drawn to the menagerie of dead animals enacting human deeds and expressions. Cats standing on their hind legs, as if that had always been their true stance. The plumage of songbirds hidden beneath intricate costumes and accessories. Rodents wielding tools and weapons in defiance to the natural way they had lived their lives. The whole experience of walking through the museum took on the properties of a particularly vivid and unsettling hallucination.
"'Nuff time wasted now,"
Sage's voice echoed, sounding distant and disembodied.
"You must begin serving your apprenticeship now. Tonight."
Robbie padded through the part of the museum set within the cottages, past Sage's workshop at the far end, and in through the open doorway into the church. Until the previous afternoon, the church had remained hidden behind a curtain of opaque plastic. 2 strides into the building, Robbie understood why. This was where the larger, stand-alone exhibits had been installed. Acting as 2 sinister sentries to this part of the museum were the Minotaur and Centaur, appearing to dare the visitor to enter their domain. Suspended from the rafters of the roof, the griffin had been frozen in a chase, harried by what looked like a flock of demons, but were in fact about a dozen shaven maracas. Suspended from the rafters of the roof, the griffin had been frozen in a chase, harried by what looked like a flock of demons, but which were, in fact, about a dozen shaven macaques bearing rook wings and goat horns. To one side of the church, an Irish wolfhound's body had been manipulated to accommodate the robust rib cage of a Rottweiler, from which sprouted 3 savage heads in a convincing imitation of Cerberus, the guard dog of the underworld.
"Tonight marks your childhood's end," declared Sage's voice.
Robbie could still not locate his soon-to-be stepfather, but the voice sounded nearby. "Actually, I think you're a day late," called out Robbie. "My childhood ended last night." Beside Cerberus stood an extraordinary creation, its head and body a clashing combination of gorilla and blackened polar bear, although Sage had somehow managed to make the face assume an expression more akin to a cruel human, even with its dead shark eyes, whilst its back legs were those of a shire horse which, in themselves, seemed to have been extended by giraffe shin bones, so the entire beast stood about 12 feet high. Even from a distance, and distance is exactly what Robbie intended to keep between himself and this monster, he could read the sign saying, Grendel. Facing Cerberus and Grendel was a sphinx, flanked by squat examples of the Egyptian deities of Anubis, with his jackal face, and Osiris boasting a magnificent eagle head and neck plumage. But the eye was drawn to the end of the church, where a mock-up of a woodland clearing had been created, complete with trees, mounds of grass and wild flowers. but this was not a wood to be willingly entered. In the clearing stood 3 fawns, their deer hindquarters and bold chimp upper bodies straining to catch a glimpse of the pack of stalking werewolves squatting amongst the shadows, their dog faces and primate limbs seeming far too real to have been anything but born into the world. But even Grendel and the werewolves stood in the shadow of the rearing beast at the end of the church. 30 feet long, with a 50-foot wingspan, and clutching a sheep in its talons, the dragon was the piece de resistance of the collection. Its mere presence alone stopped Robbie in his tracks. He stood near the entrance to the church, gawping in astonishment, trying to distinguish which elements of other animals had been assembled to create the mythical creature. The head is a combination of a Komodo dragon and crocodile after extensive reconstruction to lend it more size and heft, finished with the horns of a Spanish fighting bull, said Sage, fighting out from beneath a tree in the haunting woodland scene. Being in the presence of his creations seemed to both sober Sage and send him into rapture. Neck of a giraffe attached to the body of a Suffolk punch horse, which, in turn, is connected to an elongated version of a saltwater crocodile's tail. Both head and tail have a fair amount of structural foam in them, too. The base claws are those of ostriches, but the feet have been cosmetically enhanced by having something of the great apes and cassowaries for a more realistic talon. Wings fashioned from whale baleen, giraffe leg bones, and tanned leather. Almost all of the torso covered in the hide of crocodiles, with the lighter belly scales added consistently to add a touch of authenticity. Sage listed each aspect of the dragon as if he were a poet cataloguing his lover's features. "It's extraordinary," said Robbie. "It is, isn't it? You and I have found agreement again." "Wouldn't Nostrils want this as a find?" "Nostrils?" interrupted Sage. "Your friend," explained Robbie. "The one who gets your creatures and plants your creations for others to discover." "Nostrils? You mean Freddie Frobisher," Sage smirked. "Yes, I see what you mean about the nostrils, though." "Wouldn't he want the world to discover a dragon?" "Ah, indeed. But it wouldn't take zoologists long to spot the joins," replied Sage ruefully. "Or discover the wings were ordinary cowhide and whale baleen. That's even before they find the structural foam. The trick with these false finds is to make them credible, not to outreach yourself, Robert. Sadly, this dragon will never fly farther than this church." Gabriel Sage rightly believed that not only did most of the larger exhibits need no mock environment or context, but that the spectacle of these mythical creatures captivated the brain and the eye with the sheer audacity and sheer traversity of their existence. Taking care not to stray too close to any of the exhibits, Robbie could not help himself from walking up to the Sphinx and staring at its face in disbelief. The features were slightly awkward in the way they were set, and there was a waxy sheen to the skin as if the preservation process had been unsuccessful, but it was clearly not the head of an ape. With mounting revulsion, Robbie stared into the eyes of the mythical beast and wondered if Nostrils had finally delivered to his business partner the only animal specimen that had eluded Sage until now. "It can't be real," Robbie finally managed to utter, craving the sound of his own voice in a place of threatening silence. "It can't be real. It can't be a real..."
human, Sage finished his sentence for him. Would that it were, Robert. My Sphinx would look a damn sight more convincing without this silicone facsimile. Most of these creatures lack a touch of humanity.
So does the Creator, Robbie could not help muttering under his breath.
What was that? Sage demanded, spinning on his head and almost colliding with Anubis. I said they still look pretty menacing and perverse to me, Robbie lied. You're very kind, replied Sage, with the utmost sincerity. But a great deal of my work is comprised over this issue. Like so many brother artists and scientists before me, my work is thwarted by those with a lesser vision than my own. Gabriel Sage surveyed his work and was silent for so long, Robbie half expected that the man had fallen asleep on his feet. Anyway, enough of such longing, Sage eventually continued. This is what I have planned for you. In the centre of the church, where the former aisle might have been, were a number of other display cases, and Sage now shepherded Robbie over towards an exhibit of concentric circles making an amphitheatre. Are you here to stay, Robert? Or are you going to flee back to your grandmother's again? Robbie knew that his life, such as it was, now lay here in Chuffing Sodmore with his mother and this man.
I'm staying.
Good. The museum is to open soon, and you will help advertise us by creating an exhibit. Stepfather and stepson working together. I have created the architecture for you, but at nights you will create all the occupants of the Flavian amphitheatre watching a gladiatorial combat. I will lock your room, but you may have access to any animals stored in the kitchen, not the workshop. Understood? Robbie considered defiance, but realized he had nowhere to run now. He nodded, and Gabriel Sage lurched back past him. Then the man stopped, reached inside his pocket, and drew out a craft knife. Slowly he exposed the thin blade. I understand that my work comes at a price, and, after all, the priest must face his first test of faith. But I was of the mind that I should exact some sort of payment for my guidance, said Sage with more than a hint of threat, as well as to punish you for running away into the bargain. Gabriel Sage mimed slashing Robbie across the knuckles and then pretended to slice open one of Robbie's eyes. I shall have to think up some apt punishment, he declared enigmatically. As he retreated the blade back into the handle, he grinned, smoothing down his moustache at the same time. What do you mean? Getting me to do this? Asked Robbie, pointing at the model amphitheatre. That's part of it. Good night, Robert. Don't let the bugs bite. Robbie was so famished, so drained, he could not muster enough emotion to hate Sage or try to work out what his payment might be, but headed for the kitchen for a snack, or anything that was edible and not soaked in preservative. As he sat thoughtfully munching his way through a sandwich, with the overpowering vapours of chemicals wafting around him like a sickening miasma, Robbie considered his options. Escape was pointless now he would not be returning to the only alternative of his grandmother's house. Yet, if he did not show some kind of defiance, some sort of rebellion towards his soon-to-be stepfather, Robbie knew that any spirit left in him would wither and expire as he became Sage's drone. The only conclusion Robbie arrived at was that the best way to mutiny against Sage, at least for the moment, was to try out-Sage him. Robbie loathed taxidermy, but he would put these feelings aside to strive to create a gladiatorial masterpiece of an exhibit in an attempt to make it look like an effortless and innate gift. In short, Robbie would try to plant the seed in Gabriel Sage's mind that his talent for posing dead animals was not so special after all, to diminish the way his stepfather viewed his own ability. Robbie had no idea if he had the capacity to produce such a work, but, if nothing else, it would get Sage off his back for a while. Arranged before Robbie on the kitchen table were 10 different animals between 3 to 8 inches in length, all lined up as if auditioning to play the starring roles in the Roman scene. The gladiators had to be chosen first. Even before Caesar, Robbie understood that he had to get the gladiators right, because making the spectacle engaging was the key to the success of the whole piece. One animal stood out instantly, by dint of it already bearing an obvious weapon in the shape of a horn, as well as being heavily armored. The rhinoceros beetle was 4 inches long, powerfully built, and was a deep, unbroken black from tip to toe, although the way it caught the light frequently made the animal appear as if it was coated in chrome. In the insect world, this specimen was clearly a heavyweight, capable of taking on all comers in any head-to-head. This would be his myrmidon, his armored gladiator, Robbie decided. Identifying the beetle's opponent proved a little trickier, though. Robbie toyed with the idea of setting the beetle against a crab, but the very notion of the fight seemed absurd. Where and when in nature would the two animals ever meet? Robbie was determined that the beetle should be locked in combat with a creature it could feasibly meet, if alive. Only then did he believe he might be able to show the character of each animal. Several of the other creatures did look fearsome enough to take on the rhinoceros beetle, particularly the tarantula. But, in the end, the pleasing physical contrast between the two opponents was how Robbie decided upon the Chinese mantis. If insects were capable of sleek beauty, then this example was stunning in a sinister sense. A full 6 inches in length, with long, powerful, hooked front legs, this was a creature that relied on stealth, cunning, and lightning speed, as opposed to the beetle's brute strength. The mantis would be his retiarius, his barely armored, net-wielding gladiator. Quickly devouring the last of his sandwich, Robbie was glad to remove the brittle bodies of the two insects into the church, exchanging the overwhelming smell of formalin and other preservative concoctions for the company of monsters. Robbie fought the chilling sensations that coursed up and down his spine as he tried to overcome his fear of turning his back on Grendel and Cerberus to work on the Roman amphitheatre. But every now and then he would catch a glimpse of a crouching werewolf in the corner of his eye. Then he would have to stand with his back to a wall for a few minutes to calm his nerves and shout out loud, "Settle down, Robbie. Stop being so idiotic." They were never real. They will never move, as if the sound of his own voice was enough to exorcise the spirits and the threat of these monsters. Robbie had been exposed to Gabriel Sage and his work for long enough to understand the various methods of how to preserve different animals. It appeared that Gabriel Sage had been experimenting with cocktails of chemicals for some time now, until he had found a couple of preferred methods of preserving animals from the right astringent solutions to evaporate the water and lock up the cells of an animal to stop it rotting, to completely plasticize them. Robbie knew that the insects had been placed in a freezer for 3 months to dry them out. Unfortunately, such measures also made the animals brittle. Robbie took the bottle of Sage's own product, put on the heavy-duty protective gloves, and dipped the animal's entire body into the solution. He then had to wait 5 minutes whilst the cell walls of the animal's bodies softened and became more flexible. Keeping on the unwieldy gloves to stop his own skin cells being exposed to the solution, Robbie had about 2 to 3 hours to work with the insects before they took on a bodily shape forever. Choosing a couple of appropriate costumes that Gabriel Sage had a tailor in Thailand working on almost constantly, he attempted to dress the insects as gladiators, complete with weapons, as Sage would have done. But they merely looked ridiculous and undignified, and Robbie had no interest in endowing them with human qualities. Both creatures seemed to be silently screaming out that they did not need costumes or weapons to battle. Robbie agreed with them and stripped them bare again. They would fight as befitted their character. Robbie began by building a small structure of gossamer-thin carbon fiber scaffolding, no thicker than an insect's leg, attached to tiny ball and socket joints upon which the gladiators would rest. Then he set about modelling the creatures. The rhinoceros beetle was the easiest specimen to work with, partly because Robbie had allowed what he thought was the personality of the insect to dictate the character of the battle. It was to stand squarely on its legs, thrusting upwards with its head, using its natural armor and weapon at its most effective. Its opponent was to react to this attack. As he had expected, a couple of the beetle's legs snapped off from the thorax during the modelling process. Robbie reached for another of Sage's miraculous solutions and, within a minute, the insect was attached to a full complement of limbs once more through the aid of invisible glue. The spindly Chinese mantis was more fiddly and delicate to manipulate, especially with the heavy-duty protective gloves. On one occasion, Robbie had been working with such focus on its back legs that he had not noticed that the mantis's head had become detached and was now blankly staring up at its opponent's underbelly. But Robbie remained determined to show a lithe opponent to the beetle's sturdy gladiator. 4 legs and 1 detached head later, the gladiators were complete. The rhinoceros beetle's horn was jammed up under one of its opponent's grasping front legs, as if piercing the armpit, causing the whole mantis to be heaved up onto one side. But the mantis was far from being a victim, its other front leg having grasped the beetle by a ridge of its armature, as if pulling its opponent's eyes towards its own open jaw. When Robbie stepped back from his work, it was with a peculiar sense of pride that he acknowledged how well he had captured the straining energy of the 2 creatures as they remained fixed, frozen in a confrontation that would never end. Before brushing both insects with a locking solution that would seep into their bodies and forever set their cells like concrete in their new postures, Robbie apologized to the rhinoceros beetle and the Chinese mantis. The last hour before dawn he spent finishing off the beetle and the mantis with concessions to the human roles they were playing, such as clear beads of sweat, as well as trails of blood and dust. So engrossed was Robbie in his gladiators that, when he stepped back, he was startled to find Gabriel Sage stood beside him. Gabriel Sage looked unkempt and stern, possibly from a hangover. "You didn't dress them as gladiators," he started. "I didn't need to dress them as gladiators," replied Robbie. "They're ferocious enough as they are." Sage stared curiously at Robbie and walked around the 2 creatures, frowning critically as he examined them. "This is not how I would have approached the subject," declared Sage. "But this is my work," said Robbie defiantly. Sage nodded. "We'll see where this goes."
Only after Robbie had finished storing away the various chemicals and tools did he notice Gabriel Sage hard at work on the two gladiators. Robbie returned expecting to see his beetle and mantis dressed in Roman costumes and wielding weapons, but was surprised to discover that all Sage had done was add a couple of eye lenses onto the faces of the insects. The addition of the lenses was expertly done, and certainly lent the fight more emotion. But Robbie still found the concept of human eyes on insects fairly ridiculous and insulting. Only later did Robbie grasp that for Sage to make a single, lone alteration to his gladiators represented a silent compliment to his work. Sage had been impressed. Chapter 14. Night Vision. Over the following weeks, Robbie gradually became accustomed to the lack of sleep in fulfilling the nocturnal role demanded of him by his soon-to-be stepfather. He now realized that he had made a serious miscalculation in producing an excellent gladiatorial scene. If his work had been poor or inferior, he would not have condemned himself to weeks of toiling night shifts on the exhibit, with Sage insisting on the same high quality. Instead, Robbie might have been left to his own devices and to sleep. He would have rested during the day, but his mother, who still appeared unaware of Robbie's nighttime duties, had recovered somewhat, and sensed that through her illness she had neglected her son. Robbie's running away back to her mother had galvanized Ellie Ash into action and into making amends for the time they had lost together. Having trained and taught as a teacher for a couple of years in a secondary school, Ellie Ash felt quite capable of educating her son at home, and had now made a definite decision to do so. All too aware that her son's recent education had at best been erratic, what with the move and her recent illness, Ellie Ash was attempting to make up for it now in the downstairs room that functioned as the museum storeroom, as well as Robbie's bedroom and classroom. Due to her heavy pregnancy, she tired easily, but Robbie's mother had spent almost every weekday from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon on lessons, hardly paying any attention at all to the museum. Every morning before lessons, Robbie and his mother would tour around the exhibits arm in arm, both of them glad to spend time in each other's company. Ellie Ash would always comment on how good the Flavian amphitheatre was looking, knowing her son had had a hand in it somewhere. Robbie was over halfway through his work on the gladiators exhibit, continuing to place well over 1,000 animals, mainly insects dressed in togas, as the Roman crowd, all overseen by the small toad who was Caesar, surrounded by newts as his praetorian guards. However, the Hall of Mythical Miracles, as Sage had dubbed the church, troubled Ellie Ash. A one-off comment became her daily sigh. "What am I marrying?" Robbie knew better than to offer an answer to the question, but found the asking of it very telling. "When are you marrying?" he asked on a grim weekday morning deep in a dismal autumn. "I think Gabe and I will wait until the baby's born now," Ellie answered uncertainly. "You're right, though. We should set a date. We've even stopped discussing the wedding over the last few weeks whilst Gabe has got all his projects up and running." She blinked her way through a series of thoughts. "Talking of projects, back to your room for more work on punctuation and thermal plasterboard, I think." Not only were mother and son spending more and more hours on Robbie's education, but Ellie Ash had also decided they should spend time on a joint project, namely the decoration and refurbishment of the crypt in which Robbie slept into a proper bedroom. If Robbie had not prized his mother's company so highly, he might have sacrificed the better bedroom for more rest. The late nights on the Colosseum, combined with days engaged in education or decoration, were taking their toll on him. Ellie Ash, too, was less than fully fit, but was incredibly energetic in her pregnancy,
and would not allow her son to mollycoddle her. "The girl's only carrying a child, Robbie, not a rhino," she chastised her son gently as Robbie tried to help her carry in a drill. "She's not a complete invalid. Besides, you're looking a bit peaky yourself, sweetheart," she added, brushing his cheek. "All okay?" "Just a general feeling of under-the-weatherness, Mum. You might want to lay off those big breakfasts Gabe has started to cook us. They make me feel a little lethargic too." "Mum, have you and Grandma fallen out?" asked Robbie. "We're always falling out, Robbie," Ellie Ash explained. "I sometimes wonder when we were ever falling in. It's hard to explain, but I cannot remain in her company for long, probably because she never seemed to be around for me when I was younger, and when I craved time with her, longed for time with her, always off on her business ventures, making a fortune with all those shifty-looking colleagues. I would have traded it all for a few more bedtime stories, for teaching me how to ride a bike, how to swim, making cake mixes together, colouring in a picture or two with her, dressing up, you name it." Ellie Ash stopped assembling the newly bought bed for Robbie and turned her thoughts inwards. "I sometimes wonder if I'm envious of your father for that," she continued, "being his apprentice and all like Ivor. I may have been jealous that he was spending more time with her than me, her own daughter. I may have picked fights with him over it, and he was so patient with me, Robbie. Some days he must have felt he could do nothing right for me. He was the perfect husband. I couldn't have asked for a more ideal man. How could the poor man have known he was the rope in a tug-of-war between a jealous daughter and her thoughtless mother?" She put down the hex key to give her son a sudden, smothering hug. "I have to say, I cannot fathom Grandma's relationship with Ivor," she went on. "Oh, don't get me wrong, I know they're not lovers. But she is getting on. What does she need an apprentice for these days?" Robbie felt tempted to relay to his mother all he knew, but bit his tongue instead. "You miss her and Ivor, don't you, sweetie?" Ellie asked. "Not as much anymore. We all have our own lives," replied Robbie. "What did Grandma get up to with her shifty mates? Did you ever notice?" "I resented them, Robbie, both the clique and their activities. I never took any interest in their shady business," Ellie Ash replied frankly. "Why do you ask?" "No reason." "I don't know why I keep moving, Robbie. I don't know why I can't stay close to her, but I just can't. I'm sorry." "We're here now, Mum." "And here to stay. Though I'm not sure about the neighbours," she added, nodding in the direction of the exhibits in the museum. "Oh well, at least they're quiet. Did I mention that Gabe and I want to have a home birth for the baby?" "What do you think of the Hall of Mythical Miracles now?" asked Gabriel Sage as he sauntered through the door, his raised eyebrows suggesting mild surprise that they were even bothering to make the room more inhabitable. "Quite breathtaking," she exclaimed. "I particularly like the gladiators," she added, turning Gabriel Sage's look of smug triumph into one of irritation. "It's fine work, isn't it, Gabe? My boy's so talented." "It is good. Yes, well done, Robert," Gage replied in a monotone. "I'm glad you're tackling this room, because I thought this would be perfect as the museum shop," exclaimed Sage, pacing across Robbie's bedroom as if taking approximate measurements. "But where would Robbie go?" asked Ellie. "We only need it during the day. He can still sleep in here." No, Gabriel, that won't do at all," said Ellie sternly. "This is now finally becoming Robbie's room, and we are not turfing him out of here." "Then where would you suggest we set up shop?" "I've no idea, but we'll have to find something else," she declared firmly. "No shop here. Robbie stays. Besides, we need a different colour scheme for the shop," Ellie Ash declared, winking at her son. Sage seemed ready to argue the point, but backed down. As long as he veered away from any criticism of Gabriel Sage, these days with his mother were exhausting but enjoyable for Robbie. However, with plenty of finishing touches needed before the opening of the Museum of Phantasmagoria, Gabriel Sage asked his wife-to-be for permission to take Robbie out for a nighttime session of collecting roadkill and, of course, she agreed if Robbie agreed to it. What choice did Robbie have?
To refuse, or even be seen to be reluctant to accompany his stepfather, would have been deemed a criticism of Sage. However, as he eased shut the passenger door of the vintage Jaguar that night, Robbie was highly suspicious of his stepfather's motives for wanting him there. This was not one of Sage's usual excursions. With no semblance of artificial lights on the moors, it was an extremely dark drive, with neither of them speaking, and, when roadkill emerged from the night spotlighted by the car's headlamps, Sage ignored the victims altogether. To Robbie's astonishment, Sage even brought the vintage Jaguar car to a halt to let a rabbit lollop across from one hedgerow to the other. However, Robbie sensed it was not an aimless drive either, as they were travelling farther and farther away from Chuffing Sodmore, far farther than they had ever ventured before for casualties. Finally, the white flashes on the face of a dead badger brought the Jaguar to a stop alongside it.
"Perfect," Gabriel Sage declared in quite a subdued tone of voice. "Robert, if you would just harvest that casualty, I'll move the car forward so you can place it in the boot more easily. Keep it on the plastic."
Robbie was spared picking up the corpse of the dead animal, however, because Sage drove the vehicle forward for about 50 yards. The driver's door swung open, and Sage pivoted about on one leg to address Robbie half in, half out of the car.
"Wouldn't worry about the badger,"
Sage smirked, and then he pointed across the dark moors.
"It'll be a long way to carry it, as Chuffing Sodmore is 15 miles that way as the crow flies. Nearer 25 if you stay on the roads. Did you think there'd be no punishment for running squealing back to your grandmother's? You are such a disappointment to us, Robert."
He shook his head before tossing Robbie's coat into the road.
"You might need this. See you in the morning. Safe travels."
Robbie watched with disbelief as the red lights of the old Jaguar vanished up the road. Soon, the landscape swallowed all trace of light other than the dim moon, the stars, and a vague glow of the white stripes of the dead badger beside him. Robbie flung up his torrent of swearing towards the Milky Way. After a few minutes, Robbie's eyes adjusted slightly to the darkness, but the moors were so black that the night vision only provided him with the ability to distinguish the silhouetted edges of the blank landscape against the slightly lighter sky. Focusing on the shape of a distant ridge and a wonky R shape of stars above the direction in which Sage had pointed, Robbie retrieved his coat, pulled up the hood, slipped on the gloves, fastened up the garment and turned on its warmth function, then trudged out across the moors. The dead of night seemed to sum up the experience nicely. Robbie might have been the last person alive. It was a landscape deleted of definition, and he would not have put it past Gabriel Sage to point him in the wrong direction either. The moors seemed to be a uniform black, but were actually full of ridges, hollows, hummocks, as well as mires. Therefore, every step was a little leap of faith. Once again, Robbie grudgingly thanked his grandmother for the boots that prevented him from wrenching his ankle. His seething thoughts propelled him along, giving Robbie uncanny energy. Even though the journey was exhausting, it resolved something in Robbie's mind. Recently, he had felt as close to his mother as he could ever remember, but if she refused to believe him over this incident, he would take his future into his own hands once and for all. The moon seemed to be on a low wattage setting, which hardly helped with Robbie's navigation of the moors. Occasionally, he thought he caught some movement on the edge of his vision, or believed he heard some unfamiliar sound carried just a notch above the rush of the wind. Every time Robbie turned his head, however, any movement or sound stopped. Nothing seemed to be following him. Eventually, he had to acknowledge that it was almost certainly his mind creating phantoms. But Robbie had spent entire nights in rooms full of monsters. What could the moors conjure to frighten him? There was no way he could gauge how far he had travelled or for how long he had been travelling. The wonky R-shaped constellation seemed to have swung slightly in the sky. The moon had shifted too, but the distant ridge remained ever distant. He might have been walking for hours. Robbie's hand felt for the flat little box containing the communication device his grandmother had given him, but he was determined not to call her. For a start, how could he direct her to pick him up when he had no idea where he was? But there were other, more convincing reasons not to call her too. When Robbie believed himself to be completely lost and would have to wait until dawn to find his way, the weak moonlight finally revealed a mere suggestion of two silver parallel lines that could represent no natural formation. Railway tracks. As he slogged along them, the railway lines seemed to stretch on to eternity, and the moors seemed the extent of the entire world to Robbie. However, the ground was even and regular to walk upon, although its very monotony sapped his energy and meant that Robbie now, more than ever, had to battle tiredness and force himself to keep moving, because the idea of climbing up onto the embankment and lying down on the soft earth and just letting the warmth of the extraordinary coat lull him to sleep was an invitation his brain kept surfacing into all his conscious thoughts. Finally, in the dawn light, Robbie stumbled across a small station. It was the same one that he and his mother had arrived at several weeks ago when Sage had neglected to collect them. Not for the first time, Robbie asked himself the question, what does she see in him? Robbie swayed and lurched along the couple of miles of road from the station to the village, barely half awake. So lost was he on the threshold between sleep and waking that Robbie only just managed to pitch himself out of the way of an oncoming black van that had beeped at him. As the van passed him, Robbie had a brief glimpse of the man waving and grinning at him from behind the wheel. It was Sage's friend, Freddie Frobisher, the one Robbie called Nostrils. Only then did Robbie realize that his whole abandonment on the moor was almost certainly because Sage and Nostrils had wanted him gone and out of the way, and Robbie could guess why. When he finally stumbled back into Chuffing Sodmore Square 20 minutes later, it was to find his mother panicking and being comforted by an anxious-looking Gabriel Sage.
"Why would you do this to me again?"
Ellie Ash began in something just short of a shout.
"Don't even bother inventing a lie, Robert. Gabe has told me what happened. You ran away from him the first chance you got, like you ran away to your grandmother's. I've phoned the police about you. Poor Gabe has been out searching the moors for you all night. How can you be so selfish? You know what state I'm in, and now you come back expecting everything to be all right and lovely after keeping your poor father out all night. Poor Gabe only woke me up half an hour ago to tell me because he was so worried about you and what it would do to me. You see, Robert, he's not just thinking of himself. Gabe's not selfish unlike the others. I don't know why I bother. Honestly, Robert, I don't know why I bother."
Robbie did not try to defend himself to his mother. He was not sure he could trust himself with a response. Exhaustion, but also a solid resolve, had taken root inside him. By taking Sage's side without even asking for his version of what happened, Robbie was beyond angry with his mother. Over the long night walk, Robbie had time to work through the different scenarios that might occur when he returned to the Museum of Phantasmagoria, and this was one of them. He had vented his emotions about this version of what might happen out on the moors. Therefore, he was calm and almost grateful to his mother that her reactions had made up his mind for him. He knew where his future now lay, and it was not here. What he could not forgive his mother for was that she had launched into him so publicly in the village square. Before going inside to his room to sleep for the rest of the day, Robbie turned to see if there were any witnesses to his mother's outburst. And there, of course, was the brown-eyed girl, Isla Lovecraft, staring back at him. Far from regarding Robbie's humiliation as entertainment, Isla Lovecraft gave Robbie a sympathetic grimace. Robbie was too tired to return a facial expression. He went inside, climbed into bed, and set his alarm for early. Chapter 15. Runaway Take 2. It felt reckless and wrong to ignore the plummeting feeling in the pit of his stomach, warning him that this was not the wise thing to do, but Robbie could stay no longer. To stay and to endure Gabriel Sage's cruel, pointless punishments and never to be believed about them by his own mother was more than Robbie could bear. And now he could not even turn to the place that had always been his refuge in Bristol, because his grandmother and Ivor were, well, he did not know what to call them. Packing did not take Robbie long. Over the years, he had plenty of experience with packing and had become quite an expert. Besides, he wanted to travel light. He wanted to be up, out, and gone, with plenty of distance between him and Chuffing Sodmore long before Sage and his mother woke. Bristol was out of the question, and Robbie had no real connection to any other people or places in Britain. He would become the cliché then, the teenage runaway. He would become the cliché then, the teenage runaway hoping to submerge into London's teeming streets. Deep in his core, he knew it was a ridiculous idea, but at least it was a direction. He wrapped up a slab of cheese from the fridge, took 4 apples, and squashed a loaf of bread into his rucksack. He reckoned he was owed that at least for the gladiators exhibit, but he pocketed no money other than his own. Then Robbie ease-closed the front door of the cottage ever so gently, permitting himself a moment of stillness before he set off. In the first light of the morning, the village looked particularly picturesque, even beautiful, nestled in amongst the dips and contours of the landscape. A stone oasis sprouting amongst the eternal, undulating moorland, it appeared as if Chuffing Sodmore was tempting him to stay. Robbie was decided, however. He felt there was no future here for him. Heaving in a couple of breaths of sharp, early morning air, Robbie tried to blink away the nagging voice within, chanting that this was a bad move, bad move, bad move. The significance of the moment brought Robbie up short. From this time forth, he would not be relying on his mother or his grandmother. The path he was now on was his own, and it would be risked alone. Except that Robbie was not alone. Staring back at him from the middle of the square was the brown-eyed girl called Isla Lovecraft in her usual spot beneath the stone statue of the soldier. "Do you ever sleep?" Robbie whispered as he approached her. "No one misses me," the brown-eyed girl returned. "Bit early for a morning hike, isn't it? Or have you forgotten the dog you were supposed to be walking? My mistake. You stuff dogs in that place, don't you? Not walk them." Even though it was delivered with a deadpan ferocity, Robbie recognized it was the first attempt at humor she had ever offered him, and smiled appreciatively. "No hike, no dog, no future here. So I've decided to go." "Where?" "Not back to my grandmother's, if you've come to gloat." "I'm not gloating," she replied. "You once told me this place was yours. Well, you can have it. It's yours. I'm leaving it to you, and I'm leaving," Robbie declared, shouldering his rucksack. "Where are you going?" Isla Lovecraft asked, genuine interest suddenly igniting in her eyes. Robbie considered not telling her, but then decided against it. After all, it was hardly as if Sage and Lovecraft were on close speaking terms. "London this time." "Why? You coming?" "Are you serious?" "About London or about coming with me?" both, she replied without a hint of mockery. Robbie did not want to fall into a trap for the gullible. What are you talking about? Your home's here. Are you serious? She repeated earnestly. Yes, I'm serious, Robbie replied. For several seconds, Isla Lovecraft's expression might have been x-raying Robbie for the truth, but then she shot up off her seat at the base of the statue. Give me 10 minutes and I'll go with you. No, I wasn't serious about that part, Robbie called out after her in a voice as loud as he dared make it. The girl suddenly stopped, sped back to Robbie and held his arm tightly. Promise me you'll be here in 10 minutes. Promise. We've hardly spoken. I don't even know. You know my name. It's Isla Lovecraft. Promise me you'll be here. Robbie sighed. 10 minutes and I'm gone. Fair enough. As he waited for her, Robbie crouched down behind the statue just in case Sage decided on an early start and a quick glance across the square. It was inexplicable to him why Isla Lovecraft might be so keen to accompany him to London. They hardly knew each other after all. But the idea of not travelling alone appealed to him, and Isla looked street smart. True to her word, Isla Lovecraft was back with a minute to spare, shouldering a tattered rucksack as well as carrying a greasy cloth bag that bulged out at sharp angles and square points, and which clinked with metallic tinks. How did you get packed so quickly? Asked Robbie. I'm always ready to go, she replied cryptically. Robbie shrugged in reply and trudged off towards the moors. It only took him a few yards across the square to realise that Isla Lovecraft had not moved. He looked back at her, mystified. Why are we walking? She asked. Because we don't have any other form of transport, replied Robbie. Isla slowly turned her gaze towards Sage's old Jaguar car. Oh, but we do. A sinking feeling suddenly took hold of Robbie. I don't know how to drive. I do, she grinned back. He'd kill me. Although, Robbie thought to himself, I do come from a line of criminals. Stealing is in the blood. He must have a long reach if he can kill you once you're lost in London, Isla replied. Then she added as more of a carrot, and I can't think of a better way to burn a bridge with him. It took Robert only a minute to unlock the door of the cottage and locate Sage's keys for the Jaguar. Under Isla's guidance, the two of them then released the handbrake and pushed the heavy old car out into the square without starting the engine. After about 30 feet of pushing, Isla jumped into the driver's seat and, only once the Jaguar had begun to pick up momentum, as they were rolling down the hill, did she turn on the engine. The hefty, elegant car hiccuped twice and then growled into life, promising huge reserves of latent power. For a few heart-lurching moments, Robbie watched Isla drive away from him as Sage had done the night before, and he cursed his stupidity when he thought she was going to abandon him. But 100 yards on, the car glided to a stop and, a moment later, the passenger door swung open. Isla Lovecraft was not lying to him when she said she could drive, but it was an alarming ride at first. There was a great deal of lurching from one side of the road to the other. Gears ground against each other with an ugly, grating noise. At times, the engine over-raced, but they were making progress and were not crashing, which Robbie took as a positive. He kept glancing over at this girl he hardly knew, watching the fleeting smiles and grins erupt and diminish on her face. 2 miles into her drive down the country road, Isla seemed to settle and become more comfortable in her driving. This is truly a beautiful car, she grinned. Pity we have to ditch it soon. Gripping the passenger seat until his fingers ached, Robbie did not reply. He could offer no help to Isla Lovecraft with either her driving or their directions. They saw the headlights first, searchlighting through the hedges in front of them and spilling 2 long bright white halos up above the road. Then the police car emerged from around the bend and, in the growing light of dawn, the driver gave the occupants of the Jaguar a hard glance. The red of the brake lights came on almost instantly. Isla spotted the danger in the rearview mirror and rammed down the accelerator. In the short chase that followed, Robbie had his head craned back almost constantly, looking for the headlamps of the police car against the hedgerows and walls of the narrow country lanes. The Jaguar probably had far more power than the police car following them, but the twisting country lanes rarely allowed Isla the opportunity to make such an advantage count. Occasionally, they would make ground on their pursuer on a straight, only for the police car to gain on them as they negotiated the sharper bends. "He's probably radioing ahead for support," Robbie informed her. "I know. Damn it," Isla exclaimed. "We're going to have to ditch the car early. Your seatbelt is on, isn't it?" Isla skidded the old Jaguar to a stop just the other side of a sharp bend. "Your stepfather's going to hate me for this," Isla said with a wince. Waiting until she judged the police car was about to come round the bend, Isla slammed the car into reverse. The policeman had no chance of avoiding the Jaguar suddenly shooting towards him in reverse, but tried to swerve to avoid it, catching the Jaguar a glancing blow. There was a jarring jolt, a sickening sound of crunching, metal against metal. The Jaguar span around in the road, but the police vehicle veered off into a ditch, coming to rest at a severe angle, two wheels on one side spinning uselessly in the air. Dazed, both Isla and Robbie blinked through the shock of the experience. "You all right?" Robbie asked. Isla nodded and inhaled loudly as if she had been holding her breath. Feeling lightheaded and wobbly on his feet, Robbie lurched out of the car and slowly padded towards the still screaming police car. The engine of the vehicle continued to whine as Robbie approached it, but there were no other sounds or movement from within the car. Wrenching open the car door, Robbie leant across the unconscious policeman and turned the keys in the ignition switch. Immediately, the alarming whine of the engine ceased, leaving only slightly ominous ticking sounds from the undercarriage. It was not easy working in a car tilted over at such an angle, but Robbie found a yellow high-visibility jacket on the passenger seat and carefully rested the unconscious policeman's head until it leaned at a more comfortable angle. Without saying a word to each other, Isla checked over the police car while Robbie managed to open the boot far enough to grab two hazard signs, which he set up 100 yards down the road either side of the police car, in order that no other driver might smash into the wreck by accident. "The police car's not going to catch fire or explode," Isla explained. "We should go." Robbie was not entirely comfortable with the idea that "we" represented that they were a team or partnership. There was no way he felt he would ever have the nerve to ram a police car, and he was shocked to find that the quiet, brown-eyed girl beside him had dared to do such a thing. They were in so much trouble now, though, that running seemed to be a reasonable option. However, it only took a few dozen yards in the Jaguar to realize that they were not going to get far in Sage's car, as the rear wheel arch was rubbing against the back tire in a way that was more than a complaint they might be able to just drive through. Parking the Jaguar at the entrance to a field, the two of them set out across the moor, with Robbie glancing towards Isla Lovecraft every few moments. "Who the hell am I running away with?" he was asking himself. "A girl who could calmly take out a police car." A mile or so later, avoiding roads as much as possible, they reached the neighbouring town and headed for the train station. There seemed to be no extra police presence around yet. In fact, there were only a few early morning commuters drowsily waiting for the next train of the morning. Even so, Robbie and Isla decided to take separate trains just in case the police were looking for a pair. Unfortunately, the surcharge for early morning tickets during rush hours was extortionate, and both teenagers lost a hefty percentage of their money just to buy passage to London. The journey itself was uneventful, with no police or armed forces boarding the trains looking for two car-thieving, police car-ramming runaways, and this allowed Robbie time to process what had happened. Did he deliberately want to leave Chuffing Sodmore? Certainly. Would he have been caught by Gabriel Sage if he had trudged towards the station on his own? Possibly. Would the police have stopped them If Isla had not taken that action, absolutely. Do I feel comfortable running away with this girl? Robbie had no answer, although part of him thought he might be relieved if he disembarked at Paddington Station to find that Isla Lovecraft had abandoned him. For a few minutes, he thought this might have been the case, until he spotted her waiting for him just after the ticket barrier. Their smiles of acknowledgement to each other were almost flinches. From Paddington, they bought a travel card onto the London Underground, descending into the Tube and into the anonymity of a capital city.